The Road to Justice, Mark Hudson's Journey. Mark Hudson stood outside the courthouse, his heart pounding with anticipation. This moment was the culmination of decades of hard work, relentless determination, and countless sleepless nights. He had fought tirelessly for justice, both in his personal life and for others, and now he was about to step into a role that would amplify his ability to change the system from within. He was the newly appointed Supreme Court judge. It was a moment of pride, not only for himself, but for his community, which had long faced systemic racism and barriers in every corner of society. Mark knew that his appointment was more than a personal victory. It was a beacon of hope for others who had been marginalized and forgotten. But Mark's journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, the son of a single mother, he learned early on what it meant to fight for what you believed in. His mother had worked multiple jobs to put food on the table and still managed to instill in Mark the values of hard work, integrity, and compassion. Mark had been a bright student, always at the top of his class, but his achievements were often overlooked or downplayed. His teachers saw his potential, but many times they couldn't see past his skin color. "You'll have to work twice as hard to get half as far," his mother would often tell him, a harsh truth she knew from her own experiences. In school, Mark's academic success was often met with skepticism. Some teachers and classmates assumed he was getting special treatment, that he couldn't possibly be that smart on his own. But Mark pushed forward, fueled by a desire to prove them wrong and show the world that he belonged at the top. He excelled in his studies, eventually earning a scholarship to a prestigious law school. Even there, among some of the brightest minds in the country, he still felt the weight of prejudice. He was often the only black student in his classes, and many professors treated him as if his presence was a fluke. But Mark, undeterred, graduated at the top of his class. After law school, Mark's career took off. He became a civil rights lawyer, dedicating his life to fighting injustices, particularly those related to racial discrimination. He took on cases that others deemed too controversial or too difficult, defending clients who had been wronged by a system designed to keep them down. His passion for justice was unwavering, and soon his reputation as a fierce advocate grew. Mark was a man who believed in the power of the law to change lives, to bring about equality, and to challenge the status quo. It wasn't long before his efforts caught the attention of higher authorities. He was appointed as a judge in the lower courts, where he continued his mission of ensuring justice for all. Mark's rulings were always fair, but they were also infused with a deep understanding of the systemic inequalities that many of his peers ignored. His courtroom became known as a place where the marginalized could expect to be heard, where justice wasn't just a lofty ideal but a reality. Years passed, and Mark's reputation only grew. He became known for his integrity, wisdom, and unshakable moral compass. So, when a vacancy opened in the state Supreme Court, many believed that Mark was the obvious choice. But even then, some questioned whether a black man could or should hold such a high position. It wasn't that Mark lacked the qualifications. On the contrary, he was more than qualified. But for some, the color of his skin was still a barrier they couldn't see past. Nevertheless, Mark was appointed to the position, a decision that sent ripples through the legal community. It was a historic appointment, and Mark knew it. He didn't take the responsibility lightly. This wasn't just about him. It was about proving that people like him could excel in positions of power, but the barriers built by racism and prejudice could be torn down brick by brick. On his first day at the courthouse as a Supreme Court judge, Mark dressed carefully. His suit was immaculate, his shoes polished to a shine. He carried his leather briefcase, a symbol of his long journey from the modest streets of his childhood to the hallowed halls of justice. As he approached the courthouse, a feeling of pride swelled in his chest. This was more than just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every person who had ever been judged unfairly because of the color of their skin. The courthouse loomed large in front of him, its marble columns and stone facade a testament to the ideals of justice. Mark had always believed in those ideals. even when they seemed distant or unreachable. He had spent his entire life fighting for them, and now he would have the power to enforce them from within. He took a deep breath, savoring the moment before stepping inside. As he walked through the grand entrance, Mark's footsteps echoed in the cavernous lobby. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and fresh paper. He had been here many times before as a lawyer, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't here to argue a case or defend a client. He was here to make decisions that would shape the course of justice for years to come. But just as Mark was about to make his way to his chambers, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" Mark turned to see a tall, burly security guard walking toward him, his expression one of irritation and suspicion. The guard's eyes scanned Mark from head to toe, clearly sizing him up. There was no mistaking the look in his eyes. It was a look Mark had seen countless times before, the look of someone who had already made up their mind about him based on the color of his skin. "I'm here for a hearing," Mark said, keeping his tone calm and polite. "I'm the new judge." The guard's eyes narrowed, and a smirk crept onto his face. "Judges don't come through here. You've got the wrong building, buddy." Mark could feel the tension rising, but he maintained his composure. This wasn't the first time he had been treated like this, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. "I assure you, I'm in the right place," Mark replied, his voice steady. "If you'd like, I can show you my documents." But the guard wasn't interested in listening. His eyes flicked over Mark's suit and briefcase, as if searching for something that would disprove Mark's claim. "I don't care what you say. You don't belong here." Mark's jaw tightened, but he refused to let the guard's words get to him. He had been in situations like this before, people who couldn't see past their own biases, who assumed that a black man in a suit must be up to no good. But this was different. This wasn't just a street corner or a casual encounter. This was a courthouse, a place where justice was supposed to be blind. And yet, here he was, being judged not by his qualifications or his actions, but by the color of his skin. Mark took a deep breath, his mind racing as he considered his options. He could escalate the situation, demand that the guard let him through, or he could try to de-escalate it, to reason with the man in front of him. But before he could make a decision, the guard stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab Mark's arm. The humiliation was sudden, sharp, and deeply familiar. But Mark wasn't about to let it define him. Not now, not after everything he had accomplished. He would face this moment with the same dignity and strength that had carried him through every challenge in his life. He wasn't going to let this guard's prejudice ruin his first day as a Supreme Court judge. "Please, there's no need for this," Mark said, trying to keep his voice calm and measured, even as the guard's grip on his arm tightened. "I can show you my credentials. There's been a misunderstanding." But the guard wasn't listening. His eyes were cold, his expression hard. To him, Mark wasn't a judge, wasn't a man who had spent his entire life fighting for justice. To him, Mark was just another black man who didn't belong in the courthouse. Mark's mind flashed back to the moments in his life when he had faced this kind of treatment before, the times when he had been stopped and questioned by police for no reason, the times when people had crossed the street to avoid him, the times when his hard-earned successes had been met with suspicion instead of congratulations. He had always managed to keep his composure, to rise above the hate, and he would do so now. But this time, something was different. This time, there were people watching. A small crowd had gathered in the lobby, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Some were pulling out their phones, recording what was happening. Mark could hear the whispers, could feel the tension in the air. He knew that this was more than just a personal moment. It was a public one, a moment that would reflect not only on him, but on the institution he now represented. And then, as if on cue, something inside Mark shifted. He realized that this was his opportunity, not just to defend himself, but to send a message. A message about justice, about equality, about the dangers of prejudice. This was a moment that could change the way people thought, the way they acted. This was his chance to turn humiliation into a lesson, to turn a negative into something positive. With a deep breath, Mark looked the guard directly in the eye. "I'm asking you again, politely, to let me show you my credentials," he said, his voice steady and strong. "I am Mark Hudson, the new Supreme Court judge, and I have every right to be here." The guard hesitated, his grip loosening slightly, but the skepticism remained in his eyes. Before he could respond, a voice boomed across the lobby. "What's going on here?" Mark turned to see a tall, distinguished man walking toward them. It was Judge O'Connor, the senior judge of the courthouse, and his expression was one of shock and anger. He quickly sized up the situation, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the guard to Mark. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Judge O'Connor demanded, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "This is Mark Hudson, the new Supreme Court judge." The guard's face went pale, his grip on Mark's arm loosening completely as he stumbled backward, clearly mortified by his mistake. The phones that had been recording were now capturing the guard's embarrassment, the crowd whispering more loudly as the weight of the moment sank in. Mark stood still, watching the guard's face as the realization of what he had done dawned on him. But instead of feeling satisfaction or triumph, Mark felt something else: pity. The guard had been caught up in his own biases, his own narrow worldview, and now he was paying the price for it. But Mark knew that humiliation wasn't the answer. He had spent his life fighting for justice, not revenge. Judge O'Connor turned to Mark, his expression softening. "I apologize for this, Mark," he said, his voice sincere. "This shouldn't have happened. I'll make sure this guard is dealt with." But Mark shook his head. "I'm not asking for him to be punished," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What I want is for him to learn from this. We all make mistakes, but it's how we grow from them that matters." The crowd, which had been watching in silence, began to murmur in agreement. Judge O'Connor looked at Mark, a look of respect in his eyes, and nodded. "You're right," he said quietly. "This is a teachable moment." The guard, still looking ashamed, glanced up at Mark, clearly expecting anger or judgment. But Mark simply extended his hand. "Next time," he said, his voice filled with kindness, "remember that people aren't always what they seem. You can't judge someone by the color of their skin." The guard hesitated for a moment before taking Mark's hand, clearly humbled by the gesture. The crowd erupted into quiet applause, their respect for Mark growing with each passing second. As Mark turned to walk toward his chambers, he knew that this day would be remembered not just for the humiliating encounter, but for the lesson it had taught everyone who had witnessed it. It was a lesson in humility, in justice, and in the power of forgiveness. And for Mark, it was a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place, to fight for a world where justice truly was blind, where people were judged by their actions, not by the color of their skin. The road to justice was long and hard, but Mark Hudson knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The ripple effect of a single moment. As the sound of the courthouse doors closing behind him faded into the background, Mark Hudson made his way to his chambers with steady, deliberate steps. On the surface, he appeared calm and collected, but inside, his thoughts churned with the weight of what had just transpired. The incident with the security guard had cut deeper than he allowed anyone to see. It wasn't just about being humiliated, it was about the painful reminder that no matter how far he had come, no matter what heights he had reached, the color of his skin would always be a factor in how people saw him. Mark was a man of resolve, but the incident had stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years, a simmering frustration with a world that seemed to constantly remind him of the barriers he had faced. His achievements, while monumental, were still overshadowed by the prejudice that lurked in everyday interactions. The irony of it all was almost unbearable. A Supreme Court judge, appointed to uphold justice and equality, being treated unjustly in the very institution meant to symbolize fairness. As he reached his office, Mark took a moment to compose himself. The polished wooden door, with his name engraved on a brass plaque, Judge Mark Hudson, Supreme Court, felt surreal, a testament to his perseverance and success. But in that moment, it also felt like a hollow victory. What good was a title if it couldn't shield him from the very thing he had fought against his entire life? Mark sat at his desk, the events of the morning replaying in his mind. He wasn't surprised by what had happened. He had seen and experienced racism his whole life. But what struck him most was the fact that even here, in a place of justice, in one of the highest positions of authority, he was still reduced to being just another black man in the eyes of some. The door to his office creaked open, pulling Mark from his thoughts. Judge O'Connor stepped in, his face a mixture of concern and admiration. "Mark, I wanted to check on you," he said, his voice low and steady, but with a hint of discomfort. "What happened out there? Well, it's not something that should ever happen, especially not to you." Mark nodded, grateful for the gesture, but still processing his emotions. "Thank you, Judge O'Connor. It was unfortunate, but it's not something I'm unfamiliar with," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "It's just a reminder of the work we still have to do." O'Connor pulled up a chair and sat across from Mark. He leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "You handled it better than most would have. I don't know if I could have shown the same restraint," he admitted, "but I have to ask, why didn't you press for harsher consequences? That guard, what he did was inexcusable." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he contemplated the question. "I thought about it," he began slowly. "I thought about the anger, the humiliation, and yes, part of me wanted to see him held accountable in a way that would make an example of him. But then I realized, what would that really accomplish?" O'Connor raised an eyebrow, clearly curious about Mark's reasoning. "If I had demanded his job, or worse, his public shaming, it wouldn't have changed his mindset. It might have even hardened it. And those who share his views might see him as a martyr of their cause. But by showing him grace, I'm hoping to create a space for reflection, a moment where he, and maybe others who witness this, can realize the harm that bias causes, often without them even understanding it. Real change doesn't come from punishment, it comes from understanding." O'Connor nodded, visibly impressed by Mark's wisdom. "I see your point," he said quietly. "But it's a heavy burden to carry, being the one who always has to show grace in the face of such blatant injustice." Mark let out a sigh. "It's a burden, but it's one I've carried for a long time, and I've learned that it's better to teach than to punish whenever possible. That's the only way we can truly change minds." The conversation shifted after that, with O'Connor offering his full support and assuring Mark that the matter would be handled with discretion. The security guard would receive mandatory training, and there would be further steps taken to ensure that no such incident would happen again. But Mark knew that the real issue wasn't about training. It was about the deep-seated biases that training alone couldn't erase. It was a societal issue, one that required much more than a simple workshop to resolve. The story goes viral. What neither Mark nor O'Connor realized at the time was that the entire incident had been caught on camera by several bystanders. By the time Mark returned to his chambers, videos of the altercation had already started circulating on social media. Clips of the security guard's aggressive behavior, followed by Judge O'Connor's authoritative intervention and Mark's calm response, were shared widely with captions that highlighted the racial undertones of the situation. Within hours, the story was picked up by local news outlets, and soon after it went national. The narrative was compelling. A newly appointed Supreme Court judge facing racial discrimination on his first day at the courthouse. It wasn't just a story about an individual encounter. It was a reflection of the systemic racism that persisted even in the highest levels of society. Mark had avoided social media for most of his career, preferring to keep his personal and professional lives separate. But now, his phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had seen the video and wanted to offer their support. For Mark, the viral nature of the story was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it brought attention to the very issues he had spent his life fighting against. On the other hand, it put him in the spotlight in a way he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't sure how he felt about being the face of this particular incident. While it had brought the issue of racial prejudice into the national conversation, it also meant that his personal experience was now public property, subject to commentary from people who had never met him. As the news spread, public figures and activists began weighing in. Some praised Mark for his restraint, hailing him as a model of grace under pressure. Others criticized the security guard, calling for his immediate dismissal and demanding that the courthouse implement stricter anti-bias policies. But amid the chaos of opinions and debates, Mark kept a low profile, focusing on his new responsibilities as a Supreme Court judge while the world outside continued to buzz about the incident. The guard's reflection. Meanwhile, the security guard, whose name was Frank, found himself at the center of a storm he had never anticipated. When he had taken the job at the courthouse, he had never imagined that his actions would be scrutinized by millions of people across the country. Frank wasn't a bad person, or at least he didn't think he was. But after watching the footage of himself grabbing Mark's arm, hearing the disdain in his own voice as he ordered him out of the courthouse, he began to question everything. Frank had grown up in a small town where diversity was scarce, and his interactions with people of different races had been limited. He had always considered himself fair-minded, but now he had to confront the fact that his actions that day were anything but fair. The video didn't lie. He had treated Mark Hudson, not as a person, but as a stereotype. And now the whole world knew it. In the days following the incident, Frank was placed on leave pending an investigation, but the real punishment came from within. He couldn't escape the nagging realization that he had been part of the problem, part of the very system of prejudice that he had always believed he was immune to. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, Frank decided to watch the full video of the incident, not just the short clips that had been shared online. He watched as Judge O'Connor intervened, as Mark extended his hand and spoke words of forgiveness. Frank's throat tightened as he replayed the moment over and over. He had been wrong. There was no other way to put it. In the days that followed, Frank sought out guidance. He attended workshops on racial bias, met with community leaders, and even reached out to Mark Hudson privately, hoping for a chance to apologize personally. He wasn't sure if Mark would respond, but he felt that he needed to try. The incident had changed him, forcing him to confront his own biases and commit to doing better. Mark's decision. A week later, Mark received an email from Frank. The tone was humble, apologetic, and filled with remorse. Frank asked for a chance to meet in person, to offer a heartfelt apology and discuss what he had learned. Mark stared at the email for a long time, considering his next move. He could easily ignore it, dismiss Frank's apology as too little, too late. But that wasn't who Mark was. He agreed to meet. When the day came, the two men sat down in a quiet corner of a cafe near the courthouse. Frank, visibly nervous, apologized profusely, explaining that he had been ignorant of the biases that had shaped his actions. Mark listened patiently, nodding as Frank spoke. When Frank had finished, Mark smiled softly. "Thank you for reaching out," he said. "We all have moments when we fall short. What matters is what we do afterward, how we grow and change. I hope you'll take this experience and use it to become a better person, not just for yourself, but for everyone you encounter." Frank, his eyes filled with gratitude, nodded vigorously. "I will, sir. I promise." As they parted ways, Mark felt a sense of closure. The incident, while painful, had led to growth, not just for Frank, but for himself and for everyone who had witnessed it. The ripple effect of that single moment had spread far beyond the walls of the courthouse, touching lives in ways Mark could never have predicted. The journey for justice was far from over, but Mark knew that as long as people were willing to learn, to change, and to fight for what was right, there was hope. A judge's struggle, the battle for true justice. As the weeks passed, Mark Hudson settled into his new role as a Supreme Court judge, but the courthouse incident continued to linger in his mind. It was never far from his thoughts, not because of the personal humiliation he had endured, but because of what it represented. The incident had become a stark reminder of the long, arduous road ahead, a road paved with both triumphs and struggles in the fight for true justice. Mark had never been one to shy away from difficult conversations, and his appointment to the Supreme Court had opened the door to new opportunities. Yet, despite his prestigious title and his newfound influence, he was keenly aware of the limitations of his power. Changing laws was one thing, but changing hearts and minds was something else entirely. It was a task that would take more than rulings from a courtroom. It would require a societal shift, a collective awakening to the ingrained prejudices that shaped the world. Every morning, Mark arrived at the courthouse determined to make a difference. His chambers, lined with dark oak bookshelves and leather-bound legal texts, had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where he could reflect on the cases before him and the moral questions they posed. But the weight of the responsibility was immense. Each decision he made would set a precedent, potentially shaping the future of the legal system, and he knew that with every ruling, he would face scrutiny, not just because of the decisions themselves, but because of who he was. Mark had spent years fighting for civil rights, and now he was in a position to influence laws that could dismantle the very systems of oppression he had battled against. But he also understood that change wouldn't come overnight. The legal system, with all its complexities and rigid structures, was slow to evolve. There were forces at play, both political and social, that sought to maintain the status quo, and Mark knew that he would face resistance at every turn. Still, he was prepared. He had always been prepared, even when he was a young law student, grappling with the realities of a world that wasn't built for people like him. His life had been a series of battles, some won, some lost, but each one had taught him a valuable lesson. Justice wasn't just about winning or losing in court. It was about persistence, about never giving up on the belief that change was possible, even when it seemed out of reach. The first big case. One afternoon, several weeks after the incident with the security guard, a case landed on Mark's desk that would test his resolve and his ideals in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was a civil rights case, one that had gained national attention due to its controversial nature. A group of African American citizens had filed a class action lawsuit against a powerful corporation, accusing it of systemic racial discrimination in its hiring practices. The company, which was one of the largest employers in the state, denied the allegations, claiming that their hiring practices were based solely on merit and qualifications, not race. The case was complicated, and the stakes were high. If Mark ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, it could set a groundbreaking precedent for future civil rights cases. But if he ruled against them, it could solidify the notion that racial discrimination in corporate America was either non-existent or too difficult to prove. Mark knew that this case wasn't just about the individuals involved. It was about the broader implications for workers of color across the country. As he pored over the legal briefs, depositions, and evidence, Mark felt the familiar tension rise within him. He was no stranger to cases like this, but now, as a Supreme Court judge, the pressure was greater than ever. His ruling would be scrutinized not just by the legal community, but by the public, by activists, and by the very systems that had long perpetuated inequality. It was a delicate balance, and Mark knew that whatever decision he made, it would have far-reaching consequences. The public's eye. As the case garnered more attention, so did Mark. The media latched onto the story, painting him as a pivotal figure in the ongoing fight for racial justice. Some outlets lauded him as a trailblazer, a symbol of progress in a system that had historically marginalized people of color. Others, however, questioned whether his background as a civil rights attorney would cloud his judgment, implying that he might be biased in favor of the plaintiffs simply because of his race. Mark had always been aware that his race would be a factor in how people perceived him, but now it was becoming even more apparent. The pressure to remain impartial, to prove that he could separate his personal experiences from his professional duties, weighed heavily on him. It wasn't enough for him to simply do his job. He had to do it perfectly, without giving anyone an excuse to question his integrity. As the trial date approached, the courthouse once again became a hub of activity. Protesters gathered outside, some holding signs in support of the plaintiffs, others accusing Mark of being unfit to preside over the case. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the energy of a public that had grown increasingly polarized. Inside the courthouse, Mark maintained his composure, but the tension was palpable. He had faced public scrutiny before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about the broader fight for civil rights and the role the legal system played in that fight. Mark knew that no matter how he ruled, there would be backlash. But he also knew that he couldn't let that influence his decision. His duty was to the law, to justice, and to the people who depended on him to be fair, even in the face of overwhelming pressure. The trial begins. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, legal scholars, and activists filled the benches, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The plaintiff's attorney, a young, passionate woman named Angela Martinez, delivered a powerful opening statement, laying out the evidence of the company's discriminatory practices. She spoke about the hiring records, the disparities in promotions, and the testimonies of former employees who had been passed over for jobs despite their qualifications. Angela was fiery and determined, reminding Mark of himself in his early years as a civil rights lawyer. She spoke with conviction, her words resonating with those in the courtroom who had experienced similar struggles. Mark watched her closely, impressed by her dedication, but also aware of the immense challenge she faced. This was a David and Goliath case, and the company's legal team was formidable. The defense, led by a seasoned attorney named Jonathan Kramer, was equally prepared. Kramer's strategy was to discredit the plaintiffs, to argue that the disparities were not the result of racial bias, but of individual performance and qualifications. He pointed to the company's diversity initiatives, highlighting the small percentage of minority employees in leadership positions as evidence that they did, in fact, hire people of color. As the trial progressed, the testimonies grew more emotional. Former employees took the stand, recounting their experiences of being overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed. Some spoke through tears, their voices shaking as they described the pain of watching less qualified white colleagues rise through the ranks while they remained stagnant. Others, hardened by years of systemic discrimination, spoke with anger, their frustration palpable. Mark listened intently, his heart heavy with the weight of their stories. He knew these stories all too well. They were the stories of countless people who had come before him, who had fought for a seat at the table only to be denied again and again. But as a judge, he had to remain neutral, to focus on the evidence and the law, even as his emotions tugged at him. A personal reflection. Each night, after the trial proceedings ended, Mark returned to his chambers, exhausted but reflective. The case had stirred something deep within him, something that he had long tried to suppress. It reminded him of the struggles he had faced, not just in his career, but in his life. The long, painful road of fighting for recognition, for fairness, for justice. And now, as he sat in a position of power, he wondered how much had really changed. In quiet moments, Mark thought about his own experiences with discrimination, the way people had looked at him when he first started practicing law, the skepticism in their eyes when they saw a black man walk into a courtroom. He thought about the security guard and the incident that had brought his own biases to the forefront of national conversation. And he thought about how, even now, as a Supreme Court judge, he was still fighting the same battle, just on a different stage. But Mark also knew that he couldn't let his personal feelings interfere with his duty. This case wasn't about him. It was about the plaintiffs, about the people whose lives would be impacted by his decision. It was about the future of civil rights in the workplace, about whether companies could continue to hide behind the facade of meritocracy while perpetuating systemic racism. The ruling. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and legal arguments, the trial came to a close. The time had come for Mark to make his ruling, a decision that would not only determine the outcome of the case, but also set a precedent for future cases of this kind. The weight of the moment was immense. But Mark had never been one to shy away from responsibility. He took several days to review the evidence, to think carefully about the legal precedents and the arguments presented by both sides. It wasn't an easy decision, but Mark knew that justice wasn't always easy. It required careful consideration, a balance of facts and emotions, of law and humanity. When the day of the ruling arrived, the courtroom was packed once again. Mark sat at the bench, his face calm but serious. The plaintiffs, the defense, the public, they all waited with bated breath as he began to speak. Mark's ruling was detailed and thorough. He acknowledged the complexity of the case, the arguments from both sides, and the legal precedents that had shaped his decision. But in the end, he ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The evidence of systemic discrimination was clear, he said, and it was time for companies to be held accountable for their actions. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps. The plaintiffs embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces. For them, this ruling wasn't just about money or compensation. It was about validation. It was about finally being seen and heard. But Mark's ruling didn't end there. He also called for broader reforms, urging companies to take proactive measures to address racial disparities in the workplace. He emphasized that the fight for civil rights wasn't over, and that the legal system had a duty to ensure that justice was not only served but upheld in every corner of society. The aftermath. In the days that followed, the ruling made headlines across the country. Mark's decision was hailed as a victory for civil rights, a landmark case that would influence corporate policies for years to come. But it also sparked controversy, with some accusing him of overstepping his bounds as a judge and letting his personal biases influence his decision. Mark remained steadfast in the face of criticism. He knew that his ruling was fair, that it was based on the law and the evidence, and he knew that this was just one step in a much larger journey, a journey that would require continued vigilance, continued advocacy, and continued courage. As he reflected on the case and its outcome, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road to justice was long and winding, but it was a road he had chosen to walk. And with each step, he knew that he was getting closer to the world he had always envisioned, a world where justice truly was blind, where people were judged by their actions and not by the color of their skin. The battle wasn't over, but Mark Hudson was ready for whatever came next. A heavy crown, the weight of justice and public perception. In the weeks following Mark Hudson's ruling in the landmark civil rights case, life at the courthouse continued as usual, at least on the surface. The same echo of footsteps on marble floors, the same hushed conversations between lawyers and clients, and the same unflinching march of justice. But for Mark, things had changed. The atmosphere around him felt different. Though the routine remained the same, he was acutely aware that the eyes of the public were upon him more than ever. The ruling in favor of the plaintiffs had sparked nationwide debate. To some, Mark was hailed as a hero, a symbol of justice who had taken a stand against corporate racism. To others, he was a man whose personal biases had clouded his judgment. His detractors, many of whom had never stepped foot in a courtroom, saw his ruling not as a fair assessment of the case, but as a decision driven by his race and his background as a civil rights lawyer. Mark, who had spent his entire career fighting for the underdog, now found himself at the center of a new battle, one that called into question his impartiality and his role as a judge. He had expected controversy. That was part of the job. But what he hadn't anticipated was the deeply personal nature of the criticism. Articles were written dissecting his life, his career, even his childhood, as if searching for some hidden flaw or motive that will explain why he ruled the way he did. Some of the attacks were subtle, questioning his objectivity as a black man ruling on matters of racial discrimination. Others were more overt, accusing him of advancing a political agenda under the guise of justice. Mark had dealt with prejudice before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him. It was about his integrity as a judge. The very thing he had spent his entire life building, his reputation for fairness and justice, was now being questioned. And though he knew that he had made the right decision, The weight of public opinion bore down on him like a heavy crown. The personal toll. At home, the strain of the case began to take its toll. Mark had always been a private man, carefully separating his professional life from his personal one. But now that separation felt impossible. His wife, Serena, had been his rock throughout his career. She understood the pressures he faced better than anyone, having supported him through the grueling years of law school, the long hours in court, and the many sleepless nights spent preparing for cases. But now even Serena could see the exhaustion etched on his face. "You're carrying too much," she said one evening as they sat together in their living room, the dim glow of a lamp casting shadows on the walls. "I can see it in your eyes, Mark. You're not just dealing with the legal stuff. You're taking all of this criticism personally." Mark sighed, leaning back against the couch. He had always been able to compartmentalize his work to keep his emotions in check. But this time, the line between the personal and the professional had blurred in a way he hadn't expected. "It's not easy," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "I knew there would be backlash, but it's different when people are questioning your character, your motives. I made that ruling based on the evidence, based on the law, but all they see is a black man ruling on a case about racial discrimination. They think I'm biased, that I'm pushing some agenda." Serena reached out and placed her hand on his. "You know that's not true. The people who matter know that's not true. You've always been about justice, about doing what's right, and anyone who really knows you understands that." Mark nodded, appreciating her words, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. He had spent years cultivating a reputation for fairness, for objectivity, and now it felt like all of that was being undermined by a single case. He had expected the corporate lawyers to push back, but the attacks from some members of the public, the people he had always fought for, stung the most. Serena could sense his internal struggle. "You're not responsible for what they think," she said softly. "You've done everything you can. You made the right decision, and you know that. The rest is out of your hands." Mark looked at her, grateful for her unwavering support. But deep down, he knew that it wasn't just about this one case. It was about the larger fight for justice, about the role he played in a system that was still rife with inequality. And as much as he tried to push it to the back of his mind, the criticism gnawed at him. He couldn't help but feel that he was being judged not for his rulings, but for who he was. The pressure mounts. At the courthouse, the atmosphere had shifted as well. Though his colleagues were professional and supportive, Mark could sense a subtle tension in the air. Some of the other judges, most of whom were white, had begun treating him differently. It wasn't overt. No one said anything outright, but there was a new distance between them, an unspoken divide. It was as if his ruling had marked him as someone to be watched more closely, as though his decision had exposed him as a different kind of judge. Mark wasn't naive. He knew that his race had always made him stand out in the legal community. As one of the few black judges in the state, he had always been aware that his every move was scrutinized more closely than that of his white counterparts. But now, after the ruling, that scrutiny had intensified. His decisions were questioned more often, his opinions picked apart for any sign of bias. It was exhausting. One afternoon, Mark found himself in a meeting with Judge Harold Anderson, a senior judge who had been on the bench for over 30 years. Anderson was known for his conservative rulings, and though he and Mark had always been cordial, they had never been particularly close. "I wanted to talk to you about the ruling," Anderson began, his voice measured. "It's created quite a stir." Mark braced himself. "I'm aware of that." Anderson nodded slowly, his eyes scanning Mark's face as if searching for something. "It was a difficult case, no doubt, and I don't doubt your commitment to justice. But you've got to be careful, Mark. These kinds of cases, they're tricky. It's easy to get swept up in the emotional side of things." Mark felt a flicker of irritation, but kept his expression neutral. "I ruled based on the evidence, Harold. Emotion didn't play a part in it." Anderson smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, but perception is everything in our line of work. You've got a lot of eyes on you right now. more than usual. And when it comes to cases like this, well, let's just say people are going to be looking for any sign of bias. You've got to stay above the fray. Mark clenched his jaw. He knew what Anderson was implying, that as a black man, he had to be even more careful to appear impartial, to prove that he wasn't letting his race influence his decisions. It was a burden that white judges like Anderson would never fully understand. "I appreciate the advice," Mark said, his voice cool. "But I've always been impartial, and I'll continue to be. The law is the law, and that's what guides my decisions." Anderson studied him for a moment, then nodded again. "Good. Just keep that in mind. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Mark. Don't let one case derail that." Mark didn't respond, watching as Anderson left the room. The encounter left a sour taste in his mouth. It wasn't just the patronizing tone, it was the implication that he had to prove his impartiality in a way that others didn't. It was a subtle reminder that, no matter how high he rose in his career, he would always be seen through the lens of race. The burden of expectation. As the weeks went on, Mark threw himself into his work, trying to focus on the cases in front of him and push the controversy out of his mind. But the burden of expectation weighed heavily on him. Every decision he made felt like it carried more weight, more significance. He knew that every ruling would be scrutinized, not just for its legal merits, but for what it said about him as a judge, and as a black man in a position of power. The pressure was constant. Every time he sat at the bench, he could feel the weight of the public's expectations pressing down on him. He had to be perfect, had to walk a tightrope between fairness and firmness, between justice and restraint. One misstep, one ruling that was seen as too activist, and he knew the criticism would come flooding back, stronger than ever. But Mark was no stranger to pressure. He had faced it his entire life, from the moment he decided to pursue a career in law, to the years he spent fighting for civil rights, to his appointment to the Supreme Court. And now, as he sat in his chambers late at night, poring over legal briefs and court documents, he reminded himself of why he had chosen this path. It wasn't for the accolades or the recognition. It wasn't even for the power that came with being a judge. It was for the people who had been silenced, marginalized, and forgotten by a system that wasn't designed to serve them. It was for the young black men and women who looked up to him, who saw in him a reflection of their own potential. And it was for justice, true justice, the kind that didn't bend to public opinion or political pressure, but that stood firm in the face of adversity. A quiet conversation. One evening, as Mark was leaving the courthouse, he was approached by a young man who had been waiting outside. The man looked nervous, clutching a small notebook in his hands. Mark paused, curious but cautious. "Judge Hudson?" the young man asked, his voice tentative. "Yes," Mark replied, eyeing the man with interest. "I just wanted to say, I saw the ruling you made. The civil rights case. And I wanted to thank you." Mark blinked, taken aback. "Thank me?" The young man nodded, his eyes earnest. "Yeah, I know it's been a lot for you, with everything in the news and all the criticism. But I wanted to say that what you did, it mattered. It gave me hope. My dad, he went through a lot with his job. He was passed over for promotions, treated like he didn't belong. And when I saw what you did, it made me feel like maybe things could change, you know. Like maybe people are starting to see that we deserve better." Mark was silent for a moment, processing the young man's words. He had been so consumed by the criticism, by the pressure, that he had almost forgotten what the ruling had meant to the people it affected most. "Thank you," Mark said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "That means more than you know." The young man smiled, visibly relieved. "No, thank you, for everything you're doing." As the young man walked away, Mark stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the evening light. It was a small moment, but it reminded him of why he had chosen this path in the first place. The road to justice was long, and the burden was heavy, but moments like this, moments of hope and change, made it all worth it. The road ahead. The controversy over Mark's ruling eventually began to fade from the headlines, replaced by the next big story in the never-ending news cycle. But the impact of his decision remained. It had set a precedent, not just in the legal system, but in the minds of the people who had been watching. It had shown that justice could be done, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Mark knew that the fight wasn't over. There would be more cases, more challenges, and more moments where he would have to stand firm in his beliefs. But he was ready. He had spent his entire life preparing for this, and he wasn't about to back down now. The road to true justice was long, and there were still many miles to go. But as long as he had the strength to walk it, Mark Hudson would keep moving forward. The burden of leadership, balancing law, legacy, and the fight for equality. Months had passed since Mark Hudson's pivotal ruling in the civil rights case, yet the aftershocks of that decision continued to ripple through his life, both inside and outside the courthouse. The media had moved on, as it always does, to other stories of scandal, triumph, and tragedy, but for Mark, the impact of his ruling still lingered in every corner of his existence. The weight of being not only a judge, but a symbol of something much larger than himself had begun to settle in. Mark was no longer just a man with a gavel. He had become a beacon for those who believed in justice and a target for those who feared change. The courthouse had returned to its usual rhythms, and the crowds of protesters and supporters had dissipated. But Mark felt the change in the way people looked at him. For his supporters, he was a figure of hope, someone who had defied the status quo to make a stand for justice. For his critics, he remained a symbol of what they feared, an activist judge who couldn't separate his personal experiences from his legal duties. And yet, the truth was far more complex than either side could see. Mark knew he was not infallible, nor was he the savior many wanted him to be. He was, at the end of the day, a man bound by the law, by precedent, by the rules that governed the very system he had sworn to uphold. But that didn't mean he was content with the status quo. He had always believed that the law, as rigid as it could be, was a tool for change, a way to bend the arc of history ever closer to justice. Now, as he sat in his chambers, contemplating the cases that lay ahead, he knew that the next challenge would be how to lead, how to be a judge and a change-maker without losing himself in the process. A new case, a new battle. The next significant case to land on Mark's docket came to him under a cloud of controversy. It involved a high-profile incident of police brutality that had sparked protests across a state. A young black man, David Pierce, had been severely beaten by police officers during a routine traffic stop. The officers claimed that Pierce had resisted arrest and that their use of force had been justified. But video footage captured by a bystander told a different story, a story of excessive force, racial profiling, and a man whose life had been forever altered by a system that saw him as a threat because of the color of his skin. The case had garnered national attention, with activists calling for justice and law enforcement unions rallying behind the officers. It was a case that struck at the very heart of the debates about race, power, and accountability that had been raging across the country for years, and now it was in Mark Hudson's hands. As Mark reviewed the case file, he felt the familiar pull of responsibility. This wasn't just another case. It was a reflection of a much larger problem, one that he had spent his life trying to address. The legal arguments were complex, and the evidence was far from clear-cut. The defense would argue that the officers had acted within the bounds of the law, while the prosecution would seek to prove that they had crossed a line, violating David Pierce's civil rights in the process. But beyond the legal complexities, Mark knew that this case was about more than just the law. It was about the public's trust in the justice system, about the belief that everyone, regardless of race, deserved equal protection under the law. It was about whether or not the courts would stand as a bulwark against the unchecked power of law enforcement. Mark knew that whatever decision he made, it would carry significant consequences. A ruling in favor of Pierce would be seen as a victory for those fighting against police brutality, but it would also draw the ire of law enforcement agencies and their supporters, who would see it as an attack on their authority. A ruling in favor of the officers, on the other hand, would be viewed as a betrayal by the black community and those who had been marching in the streets for justice. As he pored over the evidence, Mark couldn't help but think back to his own experiences with law enforcement, the times he had been stopped for no reason other than the color of his skin, the way officers had looked at him with suspicion even when he was dressed in a suit and carrying his briefcase. Those moments, though far in the past, still haunted him, reminding him of the deep-seated biases that permeated every aspect of society. But he couldn't let those experiences cloud his judgment. He was a judge now, and he had a duty to be impartial, to weigh the facts and the law without letting his emotions dictate the outcome. Still, he knew that this case was about more than just legal principles. It was about justice, about fairness, about the kind of world he wanted to leave behind for his children and their children. The public eye, once again. As the trial date approached, the media frenzy surrounding the case grew more intense. Reporters hounded Mark at every turn, seeking comments, trying to get a read on how he might rule. Activists on both sides staged protests outside the courthouse, their signs and chants a constant reminder of the stakes. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense, as lawyers prepared their arguments and the public braced for what many believed would be a defining moment in the fight for justice. For Mark, the pressure was suffocating. He had always been able to tune out the noise, to focus on the law, and let the public debate swirl around him without getting pulled in. But this time, it felt different. The weight of expectation was heavier than ever, and the spotlight was blinding. He knew that whatever decision he made, it would be scrutinized, dissected, and debated endlessly. Serena, always his source of strength, tried to help him navigate the growing pressure. She knew that this case had stirred something deep within him, something personal. But she also knew that Mark was more than capable of handling the weight of the moment. He had faced impossible odds before, and he had always emerged stronger. Still, she worried about the toll it was taking on him. "You can't carry the world on your shoulders," Serena reminded him one evening as they sat on their porch, the cool evening breeze offering a brief respite from the chaos of the day. "You have to trust that the law will guide you, that your experience and your integrity will lead you to the right decision." Mark nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't ease. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's not just about the law, Serena. It's about what's right. And sometimes, those two things don't always align." Serena looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "You've spent your whole life fighting for what's right, and you've done it within the bounds of the law. Don't forget that." Mark smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering support, but as much as he tried to push his doubts aside, they remained, gnawing at him like an insistent whisper in the back of his mind. The trial. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Every seat was taken, and the tension in the air was palpable. The prosecution opened with a powerful argument, painting a picture of systemic abuse within the police department and detailing the horrific injuries David Pierce had sustained. The defense, meanwhile, focused on the officers' training and their belief that they were acting in self-defense, given what they claimed was Pierce's resistance. As the trial unfolded, Mark listened intently to both sides, trying to remain as neutral as possible. But the emotional testimonies from Pierce's family and the haunting video footage of the incident made it difficult to remain detached. Pierce's mother took the stand, her voice trembling as she described her son's life before the incident, a life full of promise that had been shattered in an instant. "David was just going to the store," she said, her voice breaking. "He wasn't a threat to anyone. He didn't deserve this." The video footage was played for the court, showing the officers repeatedly striking Pierce even after he was handcuffed. The footage, shot from a bystander's phone, had gone viral months earlier, sparking outrage and protests. Watching it again, Mark felt a familiar anger rise within him, but he pushed it down, reminding himself that his role was not to react emotionally, but to rule based on the facts and the law. The defense called the officers to the stand, and they each gave their version of events. They described the traffic stop as routine at first, but claimed that Pierce had become agitated and resisted when they asked him to step out of the car. They insisted that their use of force had been necessary to subdue him, though the prosecution's cross-examination cast doubt on that narrative. Mark watched the officers closely as they testified. They were seasoned veterans, and their demeanor was calm, almost detached as they described the incident. But something about their testimony didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the discrepancies in their stories, it was the way they spoke about Pierce, as if he were an object, not a person. There was no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused, no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of their actions. The decision. After weeks of testimony, the trial came to a close. Mark retreated to his chambers, where he spent days deliberating over the case. He reviewed the evidence, the legal precedents, and the arguments from both sides. He weighed the facts carefully, knowing that his decision would have far-reaching implications, not just for David Pierce and the officers, but for the broader conversation about police accountability and racial justice. In the end, Mark ruled in favor of David Pierce. The evidence, he concluded, clearly showed that the officers had used excessive force and that Pierce's civil rights had been violated. He ordered the officers to be held accountable and recommended broader reforms to the police department's training and use of force policies. The ruling sent shockwaves through the state. For many, it was a long overdue victory for those who had been fighting against police brutality for years. For others, particularly within law enforcement, it was seen as a dangerous precedent that would make it harder for officers to do their jobs. Mark knew that his decision would be controversial, but he also knew that it was the right one. The law had guided him, as had his commitment to justice. He had weighed the facts, considered the evidence, and ruled in accordance with the Constitution. And yet, the emotional toll of the case lingered. The aftermath. In the days that followed, the public reaction was as intense as expected. The ruling was hailed as a victory by civil rights groups, but law enforcement unions condemned it as a blow to police morale. Mark's face once again appeared on the news, and his name was invoked in debates about the future of policing in America. But through it all, Mark remained resolute. He had done what he believed was right, and that was all that mattered. He hadn't sought out the role of a hero or a symbol, he had simply done his job. But as the days passed, he realized that his job was about more than just interpreting the law. It was about leading, about setting an example for others to follow, and in that, he found a sense of peace. A quiet victory. One evening, long after the courthouse had emptied for the day, Mark sat alone in his chambers, reflecting on the events of the past few months. The battles he had fought, both in court and within himself, had been exhausting, but they had also been necessary. He knew that the road to justice was never easy, and that true change required perseverance, courage, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. As he sat there, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from David Pierce's mother. The message was simple, but it brought tears to Mark's eyes. "Thank you, Judge Hudson. You gave my son back his dignity." In that moment, Mark felt the weight of the world lift, if only for a moment. He knew there would be more battles ahead, more challenges, more controversies. But for now, he allowed himself to savor this quiet victory, a victory not just for David Pierce, but for justice itself.